This is a novel for you if you want to experience what it's like to grow up in a small, tight community. Everyone knows everything, for better and worse. If you want to understand what it's like growing up in several layers of poverty, if you want to better understand the fear and confusion a teenage girl might have when her friend's dad kisses her, because this is a book about growing up. It's about going from the age of adolescence up through the teenage years at this point for the story, trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of everything going around you, trying to figure out what's normal, what you like, what you don't like, and understanding, we as the reader fully understand, remember how tough it can be being a kid and trying to just figure out what is life all about. If that sounds right, this might be the book for you. And because it's a very, very well written and stressful story about growing up in Italy, specifically Naples in the 1950s. If that sounds right, this might be the story for you. Let's take a look. It's always so much harder to read a story, for me at least, a story with a weak main character, someone who's pushed around. And while you, the audience, know the answer, they, the character, can't seem to reach it, and oftentimes they shouldn't reach it. It makes more logical sense, especially if they're a kid or they don't have this insight that we, the reader, do. It makes sense, but it makes it stressful. It causes this disjointed feeling. And as I'm going through My Brilliant Friend, and it's a book like that, we start off with an introduction to our first main character, Elena, who's notating all this after the disappearance of her friend Lila. And despite Lila's wish to disappear completely and that there's no memory of her, Elena begins to write about everything down that happened to her. And so we go back in time and take a journey back to their youth in 1950 Naples in Italy. And one of the things that this book has a really strong, kind of three major strong points for it. The first one is realism. This is a work of autofiction, which was an unfamiliar term for me, but it's a fictional autobiography. And it's writing it from the point of view of Elena, with a huge focus being on Lila. Kind of the spotlight is all on Lila, but the point of view is from Elena. So we kind of get this, TikTok, one step, two step point of view going on as their lives move forward. And it's really, really bleak realism. I would call it a slice of life, and I think it fits the category, the genre from there, but it's different from a lot of slice of lives that I've read because it's stressful. It was a very stressful read for me because most of the time, when people think slice of life, they think quiet nature, contemplation, trying to figure out, appreciate the little moments. But for this one, it's poverty, there's violence, there's uncertainty, there's just instability. It's just change. And as a kid, we're experiencing this point of view from Elena and Lila's, and it's just like so stressful because you have no control and no idea what is going to happen next. And then the last thing for this is I think there's really great world building. Granted it's nonfiction, so there's not really a lot of, they're not introducing a different world. But for me, I'm not Italian. I didn't grow up in the 1950s, but I'm getting a real good appreciation for what it was like, the colors, the smells, the sights, the hopes and dreams, friends and family. And it builds this whole network of families all connected in poverty or not, connected by school, by neighborhood, by religion. And we understand each of them. And that's one of the things that's really impressive about this story is that it starts off with this huge cast of characters. And it's really easy to have characters in any story be completely lost in the background. But the author does a really good job of one by one kind of introducing each character, let them have some defining moment or feature, and then moving on to the next. So by the end of it, 100 pages and 50 pages and 150, 200 pages, and we have this whole cast of like 30 to 40, 50 characters, friends and families and younger siblings, older siblings, fathers, aunts and uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, friends, lovers, boyfriends, girlfriends, all of this. We have all of this that's going at play and kind of all going on at the same time. And as we step back in the world of Elena and Lila in, 1950s as they're growing up, they grow up in this little neighborhood, a bunch of small homes or, townhouses, kind of whatever, they were smashed together and everybody knows everyone. And you have these like characters that you'll have in these small towns, the crazy woman who's in love with the married man who everybody thinks is great, but maybe not so great, the local loan shark who everyone like kind of hates, but also fears. And the rich family, newly rich family arrived from poverty who's now floating it around, bragging on it with cars and TVs, and everyone is so tightly connected to each other. There's this grim cycle of poverty and banal violence, And as the reader, as we're going through this and watching, Elena go to school, Lila go to school, them go around and try and navigate through this family dynamics. This character's a bully, this character likes you, this character doesn't, and we're hoping our characters break this cycle. And this is the hope. And we get this perspective of Elena first meeting Lila, and it immediately kind of latches on towards this mix of obsession and friendship towards her. Lila has this almost supernatural confidence that Elena really struggles to follow, and we quickly realize also that Lila is just brilliant. She's basically a genius and prodigy, and so Elena immediately recognizes this and does everything she can to try and follow up with her. She decides, there's no way I could ever beat Lila. So I'm just going to try and follow her. I'm going to be second. I'm going to settle. I'm going to go for second. She does everything she can. She's studying so hard. She's doing all of this just to keep up with Lila, who seems to effortlessly outpace her. But on the backdrop, we're understanding, we got to get a better picture as we meet their families, that Elena's family, while they're not rich and they're not living in the dregs of poverty. They seem to have a little bit more money than Lila's. They also have a different view on education, specifically, even more importantly, educating a young girl, and Lila's family, it's not even a question of, as they go through middle school and they're graduating or go through graduating, looking to go into middle school, there's this question of, are you going to send Lila? Or there's a question of, are you going to send Elena? And Lila's family is immediately like, no, absolutely not. Why would we even waste the money? And with Elena's family, there's like, okay, we can try and do this if you study well. And this kind of continually goes up. And we see this in the backdrop of, despite all the education and how brilliant Lila is and all these different ways the novel shows us, there's a spelling bee, there's a competition, and she just comes in and outwardly humiliates this one person. And then for another kid, she matches them one for one because Elena knows that Lila's so much smarter, but she's reading the room. She has this extra level of emotional intelligence and maturity that she seems kind of able to read the situation she's in. But again, her father is this bitter, angry, hateful man. And her brother is like looking to become into his father. And she's trying to figure out a path to get them out of this cycle of poverty and violence, because it's utterly destroying them. And everyone's miserable and no one's going. And so there's this question as well for Elena and Lila. Will they make it out of their childhood? Will they make it into adulthood unscarred enough so that they can have a better chance in life? Or are their parents going to do to them exactly what was probably done by their own parents, to where we have this cycle simply continue? Do you marry someone you don't like, have kids you don't want, then a job that you hate to feed, to barely scrape by? Because that's always the thing that I have to, the novel continually brings up over and over again, is these people are trying so hard and they're barely getting by. It always seems like it's just not enough. They're not able to get out of this. And so what do? They eke out this poison that just seems to infect the whole neighborhood. So that way, they take out their resentment of a cruel and harsh life to ensure that no one else in their area is able to rise above it. No one is able to escape. How hard it is to be a kid. This is one part where I had a pretty good childhood, as far as childhood goes, best I could tell. And for the point of view that we were following, Elena and Lila as children, we see them grow older. We see the limitation of their understanding in the world. And we, the reader, know what's going on more than the other characters. They're bound by the limitation of being children. They're not supposed to be able to understand things, but we do. And that's part of what makes this such a stressful book. When the dad slaps the 10-year-old daughter for speaking out of place, for us, that's horrifying. For them, it's, that's dad. That's what he does, And Elena doesn't know what to make of the violence she lives around. Characters like in the book, there's a scene between the crazy woman who's in love with this husband who she says has written all this poetry for her. She picks a fight with the wife of said married poet. And it's just this brutal attack in the middle of the street. And everybody kind of watches and gawks at it like some medieval, female cat fight, gladiator fight. And then it resolves and everybody goes on. And it's just, that's normal. That's what it means to grow up in this. And you hope the characters can rise above this situation more, but because of it, we also know how unlikely it is, how hard it is for a child to recognize what's right and what's wrong in the environment they're growing up in. And this is what makes it such a stressful and kind of harder to read compared to some other books. And it's different than the stress of like Lord of the Rings, or I've been going through a lot of Guy Gavriel Kay books where they have these great women and men of intelligence and power, and they're given these great trials with which to match them. For Elena and Lila, they're kids. They're young girls growing up in poor, broken homes, trying to make sense of the daily problems that look ready, from us, our point of view, ready to swallow them whole. And there's no voice, there's no outside voice ready to tell them this isn't right. It will be okay. That's not there. You as the reader, you want to tell them that there is a future ahead of them. But Elena and Lila, they have this limitation of children from here. And there's a scene where Lila throws Elena's prized and lovely doll through this dark basement window. And Elena retaliates by taking Lila's shabby doll and throwing it down to the same basement. And then Lila's like, all right, let's go in and let's get him. And again, there's this kind of challenge that Lila has towards Elena, and Elena's utterly just terrified, utterly barely able to force herself going, only able to motivate herself because she's following after Lila. She's following in Lila's footsteps, and they're down here in the basement, and you're just waiting. And again, it's this metaphor. You're waiting and hoping that they're going to find their way out of this neighborhood and, make it out of the darkness, that they would find their own voice. And this is the question of what you're hoping for as you're reading through the book. And I talked about this in a previous video when I was going through the long ships. There's a lot of modern stories where they want to show, and maybe it's not just modern, maybe I'm picking on modern stories when it's unfair. It's possible that older stories do this, but I've seen it most commonly in modern stories, shall I say, where you'll have a moral situation, one character bullying another, or a crooked cop pulling someone over, or two doctors arguing about how to treat a patient or something. And oftentimes there is a clear explanation within the story, almost directed at the audience, which character is correct. There's like a very clear understanding that, oh, this person's right, this person's wrong. There's no it's not left up to the audience to try and figure out what is right, what is wrong. And there are sections in the story where this story doesn't do that at all. We don't fully know who's right or what to make of it. There are a lot of questions. There's a lot of moral ambiguity. There's a scene where Lila convinces Elena to skip school, and they're going to go to the beach, and it's going to be an exciting adventure. But as they're walking, they go on for hours. They, running out of water. They get thirsty. They're getting tired. They're going, and then it begins to storm. And then they turn around, walk back. And at this point, Elena's mother finds her, and after looking for her all day, and she slaps her full in the face. And we also understand that Lila's may have planned this to get Elena in trouble and possibly kicked out of school. Because at this point, Lila's not in school, Elena is. And her parents, Elena's parents, are paying for extra schooling, all this extra stuff. And almost you get this hint that Lila's plotted this whole nefarious situation to get Elena kicked out. Again, it's this, the crabs in a bucket. Every single one's pulling them down. You can't get better. You're not going to have a better life for yourself. And there's this painful situation because it doesn't do anything to dull Elena's admiration, borderline obsession with Lila. And she continues to see Lila as this larger than life figure, her hero, a person to be emulated, rather than as a true equal and a friend, a mix of worship and admiration. Well, also, she's not seeing Lila for who she truly is. And again, this goes back into the stress of the book where you're like, oh my gosh, is Lila gonna set Elena up to get, destroyed or something like that? But this is the balance that their friendship is built on. And I've talked about how this is a stressful book, and part of a lot of that stress, I kind of touched on a number of points, but a lot of it's also built on this idea of, you're worried in a story when reading it that the characters won't get a happy ending, that the girl will get away or the guy will get away, that the villain will win, or both. A lot of stories use a lot of different plot points, either a bad ending to go run away from and a good ending to run towards. And this is why, stories will often end on cliffhangers. The Hardy Boys, each chapter always ends and then they open the door and there was a voice on their side and dun dun, chapters end. Or, Dragon Ball Z, on the next episode of Dragon Ball Z, will everyone die or will they not? And what they're doing is they're trying to pull the audience in. They're putting a tense situation rather than a normal, boring, quote unquote, boring situation. And this is what it's doing to try and pull you in to see what happens next. And it works in the story. This is what it is. And this is, for me, it was quite very stressful, and it wasn't a relaxing read at all. I was always stressed that Lila would cross a line and manipulate Elena into something, genuinely dangerous that Elena won't recognize. And then she'll continue being her friend with this naive and blind worship of her, because we want both of them, we want Elena and Lila to rise above this situation. We want her come into their own as a person, to realize the influence Lila, her parents, her teacher have on her, the boys around her, the men around her. But she can't, because everything is operating in this realm of realism, this autofiction. This is a not set in the dragons and magic world where maybe you could have a 12-year-old child who's a super prodigy who recognizes I know that the morals and views that my parents raised me with are now incorrect. I will throw them off and move forward with my own ideas. That's not realistic. There's a reason why that doesn't happen. But again, this stress is what causes us to keep going. We want to see what happens next. And throughout their lives, as Elena graduates middle school, Lila begins working in her father's shoe shop. The girls hit puberty. They start dancing. They go out dancing with the boys, older boys, young men begin paying attention to them. Everyone they know in their neighborhood is getting older. That kid who used to bully you, now he's working for his father's shop. This other kid, their dad died. This other kid, their dad, their father, their mother, somebody, gets arrested and thrown in jail. These kids are older now. That kid, that weird kid, he's older now. And maybe he's attractive. Maybe he's ugly. And this novel does such a good job of kind of introducing all these different characters, which normally I do have sometimes have issues keeping track of everybody or trying to make sense of everything. But it works. It does a good job of introducing it. If you're not paying attention, though, it can definitely get toward a little overwhelming from there. But I think it does quite a good job. And what it is continually asking this question: what is going to happen to these characters? Are they going to make it out, or are they going to repeat the mistakes that their parents made? How? And again, the book is really asking these questions of, who do you grow up to be? How do you grow up to be that person you become? How does our childhoods shape us? What happens to a brilliant young girl when she's born into poverty? When she grows up in violence, what should she do? Should she sacrifice her own life? Or there's also a question of who the brilliant friend is in this, because, there's all of these things pointing towards Lila, but as you get into the book, it could also be talking about someone else, what is going to happen to these characters. So I would recommend give it a shot. However, if you are one who doesn't care for the types of stressful books, then maybe don't, because this is, for me, it was fairly stressful. I had to go back to like a Guy Gavriel okay book, because I was like, all right, I need somebody, a hero who can like start lopping heads off if stuff gets stressful. There's difference between stress and tense from there, because again, these are kids and you're always waiting and watching to see if they can make it out. So, but I did enjoy it, so I would recommend it if that sounds like something would be up your alley from there. But yeah, that is all I got. Thank you guys for watching and listening. I'm Jeff Cassidy, and this is Fiction Applied. I'll see you in the next.